formal virtual Ehrman Institute seminar. And thank you, Henry, tremendously for being willing to take this on under the circumstances, and in some ways being a guinea pig for us. So, so we very much appreciate it. And so for today, what we're going to do, just so everyone's aware, we're recording the seminar as we usually do for these seminars. And we have everyone muted right now, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with the Zoom chat box by now, but we encourage folks to write any questions or comments in the chat box. And when Henry's done with the formal portion of the seminar, he'll be able to respond to some of those comments. And you're also welcome at that point to unmute yourself and say whatever you'd like. So with that, in terms of logistics, let me just quickly introduce Henry, and I'll hand the ball over to you. So Dr. Richardson is a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University, whom I know many of you know, and a senior research scholar at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. He earned his degrees in law and public policy and PhD in philosophy from Harvard, with little known John Rawls as his PhD doctoral dissertation advisor, and did his master's thesis with supervision from another little known professor and scholar, Martha Nussbaum. So his work is in the areas of moral and political philosophy, and has been doing a lot of tremendous and impactful work in that area over the years, including quite a bit of work that many of us are aware of, going back 10, 15 years and further, on working on issues related to ancillary care and health research, particularly with a focus on low and middle income country settings, and thinking about responsibilities, obligations, the philosophical dimensions of how to frame those responsibilities and obligations that researchers and others have in the context of health research in such settings when ancillary care needs arise. And I know that's going to be the subject for today's talk, so maybe I'll just pause there and allow Henry to say more about that, share his current thinking on the topic of today's discussion, which is titled, "Can the Researcher-Participant Relationship Ground Ancillary Care Obligations?" So with that, I'll just hand it over to you, Henry.
Thank you very much, Joe.
Yeah.
And I'm delighted to be a guinea pig here. I participated exactly only once in a medical research study. And this is the only second experiment I've participated in, I think. And I'm really sorry. I'm glad that the video can work, and I'm glad to be with you all. I'm sorry not to be able to see you all, but I guess even if the video were activated, it would be too many for me to see properly on the screen. Yeah, so this has been the bioethics issue that I've worked on, this ancillary care issue, and Belsky and I did get out ahead on this issue and been in a way a privileged position, but an uncomfortable position to be owning the research, the view that's been the received view just by default. And for years I've been saying, other people need to develop other views. Myiasis done great work on that. And the relationship-based views I'll be focusing on today are another set of views that are coming up as competitors, and I'm going to sort out how I think that falls. Just to review for anyone who hasn't encountered this issue before, the definition that Belsky and I put out early on seems to become the one that people are mostly using. It's ancillary care is medical care that research participants need, but that isn't backed by any of the older, more established obligations connected to medical research. So you've got to, of course, do the trial safely. You may have to promise people some care in order to recruit them. And the sound science is connected to ancillary care, at least via the idea of equipoise. So there might be these standard reasons why care needs to be provided in the course of a medical study, but ancillary care is whatever goes beyond that. some examples, here's one we used very early, was the malaria schistosomiasis one. If you're in a resource poor area that has various infectious diseases endemic, you look at the bodily fluids and you're looking for malaria, but you will likely find schistosomiasis in an area like Mozambique. And the question is, what obligation do you owe to the participants to deal with the schistosomiasis? And then at the other end of the spectrum of medical research, and it's going to be very important to my discussion that medical research spans a huge range of types of study. You have the high-tech medicine. This arose initially in imaging studies, but now it's even more prominent in genomic work, where scientists might have a specific reason to be doing the genomic study, but once they have that data, it's such a rich data set that there's all kinds of things they might find out about participants. And again, the question is, if they find, say, a clinically actionable anomaly that's seriously worrisome, what should they do about that? So here's what I'm going to argue today, and I do hope to leave time for questions. My trouble is I've done so much in this area, I'll have to discipline myself. So the partial entrustment theory that Belsky and I put out early on has been criticized for being too harsh because one of its features is that it's limited in scope, and it covers only what researchers learn about by carrying out study procedures, and people say that's too narrow. Seeking to remedy that, some bioethicists have turned to relationship-based views. This was called for by Dickert and Wendler, and then Nate Olson and Thaddeus Metz, who I'll be talking about. Each have now thankfully developed some nicely thought out relationship-based views. I think they're each promising and well developed, but they each have their own problems. And at the end, I'll come back to the partial entrustment theory and argue that it is a relationship-based view, actually, and it's, I think, a better one. Okay, so before I get to the relationship-based views of Metz and Olson, let me expound the partial entrustment theory. It's a hybrid view. It takes as the baseline set of ancillary care obligations those supported by the duty of rescue, which is the general duty incumbent on all people in all circumstances, all of us all the time, a duty to save people from dire peril if we could do so at a slight sacrifice to our own interests. And that's rather non-controversial. You know, if somebody has a heart attack while in the research clinic, yes, you want to stabilize them, even if it's not a cardio study. But beyond the baseline, here's the part of the partial entrustment theory that gave it its name. We argue there's a special entrustment obligation that's more demanding than rescue, and that is specially owed by the researchers to the participants in their studies, and it derives from having solicited and accepted people's waivers of what we call their privacy rights, by which we mean referring to the rights not to be touched, not to have bodily samples taken, not to have medical history taken without the individual's permission. The individuals who are going into a study agree that you can do that, so you can do your procedures, and so thereby give the special purpose waiver of their right to the researchers. And we argue they get, in return for that, as it were, special responsibilities to deal with that information that they obtain. The scope restriction that is entailed by this is that these special obligations, the ones that go beyond rescue, cover only the health concerns that researchers find out about by carrying out these study procedures. So the idea is the responsibility is connected to these special permissions. When these special permissions are acted on, then the researchers have an obligation, or at least a potential obligation, subject to the strength test, which I'll get to in a moment, a potential obligation to provide the ancillary care related to what they've just found out about. So the strength factors are these: vulnerability, which means how much difference would it make to a person's life prospects, to their health, to have or not have the ancillary care in question. Dependence is the issue of whether they depend on, or the extent to which they depend on, the research team for possibly getting that care. Engagement is the factor that's most related to the idea of relationship. There's more engagement in a given study if, predictably, there's more time spent with the participants, or that time is more intense. So if you have a study of HIV wasting at the end of life with inpatients, perhaps for several months, that's going to be pretty long duration, very intense, high engagement. Gratitude, sometimes researchers owe to their participants a debt of gratitude for having put themselves out for the sake of science, going through inconvenience, a little pain, maybe even a little risk that's acceptable. Perhaps that's owed. And those are all factors that could intensify ancillary care obligations. The cost factor pulls the other way. And the cost factor we thought of as relevant to ancillary care obligation, because on an ethical basis, if you presume that the research is ethical to begin with, that's going to mean that it must be of social value. Otherwise, you shouldn't be using human subjects of the research. So the cost is an indicator of the, or is there because of the social value of the research, and the cost in terms of dollars, personnel use, or even study power, study validity. And I mentioned these strength factors here. Mostly the discussion will focus on the scope restriction, but the strength factors have been brought up by both of the relationship-based theorists I'll be discussing, because they complain that these strength factors, as the partial entrustment theory has been developed, they haven't been integrated into that entrustment rationale. I'm not sure that's a theoretical defect, because I think they are just other factors that also matter. The partial entrustment theory isn't a monistic theory anyway. But if integration were important, I just want to point out here that engagement could be pretty easily integrated with the entrustment-based basis of the scope restriction, because that has to do with these privacy waivers. And the more expected engagement there is in a study, the more time you spend with the participants and the more intense that time is, the more impingement on their privacy there's going to be. Okay, so now we come to Dickert and Wendler's objection to this scope restriction. So I didn't spell it out yet, but so the scope includes just what the researchers learn about by carrying out study procedures. But if they can simply see a condition as trained people with their naked eye, just when the possible participant is wandering around, even before they get into an examining room, then that's how they learn about the condition. That's going to fall outside the scope. Dickert and Wendler were talking about a real study of pulmonary hypertension, I believe in Mali. And these were real examples from that study. One of a little kid with chlamydia trachomatis that could just be detected visually, and similarly with the weeping leg wound from chronic osteomyelitis, probably from a roadside accident that was badly treated. So outside the scope, not covered by the theory, to say, and that seems wrong to them, and seems wrong, I think, to a lot of, I mean, it would be nice to cover them, certainly. And so they call for a relationship evidence-based view that's not going to leave out these kinds of things. When that article by Dickert and Wendler was published, I had a couple of quick initial reactions, which I put into, I guess, a letter in JAMA. One is that, again, the partial entrustment theory is a hybrid view with the baseline rescue component, and something like the chlamydia trachomatis is going to fall into that, I gather, because I gather it's relatively easy to treat with the right drugs. Something like schistosomiasis you find in a malaria study, that's going to be both within the scope if you find it out by examining the fluids the way you're supposed to in the malaria study, and within rescue because the anti-helminths are pretty cheap, at least so you can at least bring down the parasitic load for an individual on those two bases. And then sadly, it's going to turn out that some cases like the osteomyelitis, if you're in a rural setting in Africa, are not going to come within either of these if you simply see it, because it takes a fairly serious debridement operation to clean up that wound. And that is unfortunate. The second quick response I had to Dickert and Wendler was the idea of relationship as such is clearly just too vague or too broad. There's a relationship the researchers may have with the wait staff in the local cafe, and that's not something one might think about seriously as the basis of an ancillary care obligation. So some more work needs to be done, and thankfully now, as I say, Olson and Metz have put forward more definite proposals. So I'm going to start with Olson's. It was published a year earlier than the Metz. And Olson also explicitly takes up Dickert and Wendler's challenge. So his main move in dealing with the overbroadness is to narrow things down and focus just on meaningful relationships that develop between researchers and participants. So meaningful, he means ones that are seen as non-instrumentally significant. And he does, to connect this meaningfulness idea, which is an evaluative idea roughly, to the idea of obligation, Olson turns to the obligation of respect, which is presumably another one of these general obligations that everyone owes to everyone all the time, is to respect them. And he claims that a significantly meaningful relationship intensifies the respect requirements. I think that's very plausible, that last point. I'm going to grant that significant meaningfulness intensifies respect requirements. But I think there's still three questions that arise for Olson's view. Questions about subjective variability, questions about whether the view can remain focused on what intuitively seems central to the researcher-participant relationship, and questions about the threshold of significance, which comes from the notion of significant meaningfulness. So I'll take those in turn. And so let me explain how, in more detail, how subjectivity comes into Olson's view. So Olson doesn't see this meaningfulness idea as totally subjective. He thinks there's an objective constraint on it. So it's not going to count towards intensifying respect if it's an unreasonable treatment of something as significantly meaningful. So when somebody sees a celebrity doc all of a sudden and it's seen on TV and wow, and maybe that shouldn't count as the basis of the kind of meaningful relationship one's talking about. Or again, if it's a kind of bias, because the researcher is either like a person who looks like them or a person who doesn't look like them, that maybe shouldn't count one way or another either. So he has this objective constraint, but at bottom it's subjective valuation. as constrained in that way that matters to him. Now you might be thinking, this is relationship, so doesn't the relationship have two sides to it? But Olson explicitly says that for his purposes, for the purposes of his relationship-based theory, it's the researcher's duty to provide ancillary care is based on the meaningfulness to the study participant, not meaningfulness to the researcher. So once that's spelled out, I think we can all imagine ways in which this could vary widely depending on the subjective traits of the individual participants. One participant might be somebody who's always been in complete awe of doctors and worships them all, and so will have a tendency to see the relationship as highly meaningful. Another participant might have grown up as the child of two doctors, and somehow, I guess this sometimes happens, ended up being rather cynical about medicine. And that will mean that that second participant is very unlikely to see the relationship as significantly meaningful. Yet that surely is not a variation between them that should affect their ancillary care claims. But I don't see how Olson's view can avoid that. The second issue is about maintaining the focus on the researcher-participant relationship given subjective evaluation. And it isn't always easy to maintain focus just on the researcher's professional skills. There are other confounding thoughts that might come in. So suppose that the participant finds out in discussions with the researcher that the researcher also is very good at plumbing. And he thinks, wow, this is a real person, not just a technician, and that's really cool. And I admire people who can do that. And so that becomes a basis for this participant seeing the relationship is really meaningful, because here's this relationship with this whole person, rounded person that the participant has. Is that going to mean, on the basis of Olson's view, that the researcher owes plumbing help to the participant? I don't see how the view doesn't segue to that conclusion. Olson does say that a restriction would be needed to keep professional and personal apart at that kind of level, but he doesn't explain where the restriction is going to come from. Finally, even if you didn't have either of those first two problems, there's the issue of significant meaningfulness. And the thing is, in medical research, as I've said from the beginning, there's a huge there's a huge variation among different medical research studies. And it's possible to have a medical research study where the relationship is just going to be too slight to count as reasonably meaningful. And yet there can, in that same study, be huge potential for very serious, maybe potentially life-threatening conditions that are found as ancillary findings. So an extreme of this kind of study will be, again, the genomic studies I was talking about at the beginning, where the interaction can be very brief. Maybe you won't just have a cheek swab. You might have a quick demographic interview and then a cheek swab, but that's really very little to go on. And yet with that genomic data about the individual, there's, again, a huge range of incidental findings that are possible, including potentially life-threatening ones. And again, we can make that even more extreme in terms of the absence of chance for this kind of meaningfulness bonding if there's no personal contact between the researchers who got the sample and those who are doing the research with it, because they're secondary researchers using the banked sample. So I don't know, these things are hard to measure, but just intuitively, it seems to me that this significance threshold leaves out many more studies or many more potential cases of ancillary care that you might care about than does the scope limitation of the partial entrustment theory. Okay, now let me go on to Metz's view. Um, so Thaddeus Metz is a bioethicist and philosopher, really philosopher in South Africa. And for a long time, Metz has been studying ethical ideas prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa and working to synthesize them. And he has done a great job in synthesizing a lot of those ideas into what he calls a communitarian view, which is illustrated by this quote from Dismas Masolo, a Kenyan philosopher, describing the values central to this kind of communitarian view, values of living a life of mutual concern for the welfare of others, such as in a cooperative creation and distribution of wealth, and of feeling integrated with, as well as willing to integrate others into, a web of relations free of friction and conflict. In bringing this general set of ideas to bear on ancillary care, Metz conceptually distinguishes between two aspects of this view that you might see both in the Masolo quote. One is the aspect of identity, the idea of identifying yourself as a member of a group, as a member of a we that's doing something together. And then there's conceptually separate dimension of solidarity, which is the attitude of being ready to help anyone one is engaged with in that kind of way. And the way that Metz sets up his ancillary care theory is to use the identity component to ground the solidarity component, the solidarity component being the helping component. And what is that identity in this case of research, medical research? It's the participant identifying themselves with the researchers as together with the researchers working on the research project in question. So as Metz explains, this identity basis generates a scope limitation. It's going to pertain to needs that pertain to that joint research effort. And it generates a strength limitation because, okay, it's grounded on this group of people trying to do something together, namely trying to carry out this particular research effort. And so whatever ancillary care obligations are generated on this basis should not significantly undercut that research effort. There's some things that would be nice to have Metz clarify here, and maybe he will. Obviously, each individual has lots of different identities of this sort. They're identified with their fellow nationals in national causes. They're identified with their sports team that they play on, whatever. And how are these different identity demands going to be balanced? But everyone always has lots of obligations, so maybe that's just a general concern. And then it's a little bit hard to tell just how demanding is this going to be? Does it go beyond rescue? But that's just questions for clarification, which we may learn from Metz in due course what he thinks. But now here are three objections. The first is that it seems to me intuitive that you can have full cooperation as is called for between participant and researcher without any closeness. This is, again, this kind of genomic research. Maybe in the traditional village life, the two would come together, but it need not come together in medical research. Then there's, again, this idea of being used metaphorically of a shared way of life. And here, this shared way of life is engagement with the study. But it's a specific study that the participants are collaborating in. And how does that broaden out to health in general? So just to think concretely about it, take this case of a study done in Africa of the comparing how effective impregnated bed nets are against the 4 different species of the malaria parasite. And however you think about that, it seems to me that the participants who are collaborating in that are collaborating in an effort about malaria. You might not limit it to about malaria and the bed nets, but how does it get to cover any health need that they may have? I'm not sure. Metz, on the other side, is worried about the obligation to help broadening out too much. So akin to the plumbing example I raised against Olson, he's worried that maybe the researchers will, because of this solidarity, have an obligation to help their participants clean out their garages. But he says, this is not of the appropriate sort. Why not? Because it's unrelated to the study aim. But ancillary care, by definition, is not related to the study aim. It's found out, according to the partial entrustment view, by carrying out the study procedures. But it's, in any case, doesn't count. Nothing is ancillary care unless it's care that doesn't need to be provided in order for the study to go along well and otherwise permissibly. Before I transition back to the partial entrustment view, I want to touch on some broader justificational issues that Metz raised initially in a somewhat earlier article. Had this comment on the partial entrustment theory, that it was left hanging without a basic and comprehensive foundation. And I would like to think that my 2012 book provided the foundation that he would, at least something that he would count as a foundation. But in a blurb on the back of that book that was otherwise a very nice blurb that Leif Winnaar provided, Winnaar used the somewhat snarky word bespoke about the foundation that I provided. It was a bespoke foundation, so one tailored to the issue at hand. I think Winnaar, philosophers often like very comprehensive things. I was actually not so unhappy with my foundation being described as bespoke. In any case, it was tailored, and whereas Metz's foundation for his ancillary care view is the opposite of bespoke, it's not tailored to the issue at hand. It's rather this comprehensive ethical theory that he has synthesized working with the materials he's found in sub-Saharan African traditions. And he's brought that comprehensive theory to bear on ancillary care. And I think that's great work that he's doing, but there's a question that it raises. Utilitarianism, like utilitarianism, this African ethical view is held by many people. At least I take Metz's view for that, word for that. And like any view held by many people, it's worth paying attention to, just as utilitarianism is a view we must pay attention to for this reason. But that doesn't mean that either of these views is correct. And for his ancillary care theory to be correct, that view has to be correct. And that's a big ask for us. I can't obviously address that question in any comprehensive way, but in applying that general view to medical research, I do have a doubt about it because it seems a little bit romanticizing to think about to think about research always as a collaboration between participants and the researchers. Sometimes, hopefully it is, and of course always, like especially going into research poor areas, the researchers need to elicit the views of the locals and learn from that in terms of how the study should be conducted. But we know there are lots of studies, for example, by US pharmaceutical companies going into Africa because it's cheap there and they pay them, and the participants are just rather passively like being injected with the drugs and tested, and there's really very little collaboration or attitude of treating them as collaborators. And it seems a little bit romantic to me to think of that as applying across the board. So stepping back from the details of these two views, I think actually the problems are roughly shared as between the two. There's a rather narrow range of studies covered in that, in those cases where the interaction is too little, either to support significant meaning or to support the idea of collaborating together, the view doesn't apply, even though there may well be lots of potential for important ancillary care findings. The second is that in neither view is the scope that well focused on ancillary care. Both of them have this potential of widening out to all sorts of other needs besides the medical needs that the participants have. And Metz's view actually has the instability of either widening out that way or shrinking down so that actually ancillary care zeroes out because it's just focused on pursuing the study aims. And then even within a covered study, there's a somewhat narrow range of ancillary care needs covered, or there's some variability that seems arbitrary because of subjectivity in Olson's view, or because of circumstantial variability in terms of the amount of collaborativeness that's actually elicited by the research setup. So my last topic, and I'll try to finish up quickly, is to put forward the partial entrustment theory in a new package as a relationship-based view. The common relationship-based views are psychological ones. Olson's and Metz fall into this category. So Olson's looks at these subjective attitudes of evaluation, and Metz's view looks at people's subjective self-identification, or it's their psychological attitudes of self-identification as participants in a joint effort. The partial entrustment theory is a relationship-based view in a different way or of a different sort. It's a dikaiological relationship-based view. Here I take the word from Michael Thompson's amazing work on the idea of obligation. So dikaiological means pertaining to the duties that one person owes to another specific person, and that other person has a right as against the first person. And the partial entrustment theory, as I said at the beginning, is the special obligation that it puts forward is built on that. It's built on an obligation that arises from the researchers to the subjects because of a shift in their privacy rights. So that's what it's focused on. And that's what it sees. That's what it sees as the beginning of the researcher participant relationship, is at that moment of the informed consent. So there's some key advantages to this dikaiological approach. One is that it applies to all medical research studies. And secondly, that it applies to only the ancillary care needs discovered in the medical research studies and not to the plumbing or the garage cleanings out. It also, another advantage is it covers this case that I was using to raise difficulties for the other two theories, this case of secondary research with banked samples. Because it's a moral relationship. The moral relationship is, in the first instance, one that goes from the probands to the primary researchers, and the primary researchers have a responsibility back. But by transferring those probands permissions to the biobank, the primary researchers also transfer the responsibility or some of it to the biobank and onwards to the secondary researchers. And so by that chain, that moral chain of obligation, the secondary researchers can be obligated to the probands to make sure that the findings go back to them. This was work I did together with Mildred Cho, I should have said. So in conclusion, each view leaves out something. The partial entrustment view leaves out hard-to-treat conditions that are detected without using study procedures. Olson's view leaves out participants who don't find the relationship to be meaningful, and studies where the contact is simply too minimal to support meaningfulness. And Metz's communion-based view leaves out studies that are anti-collaborative in spirit and may leave out all ancillary care if it's too focused on collaborating in the joint research effort being what matters. And I hope to have convinced you that the partial entrustment theory is at least a serious contender as a relationship-based view that defines the relationship in a way that covers all research studies and explains on the basis of this relationship how special ancillary care obligations attach to the research activities as such. So thank you. And let me unshare.
Great, thank you very much, Henry.